I was just doing a bit of reading and I came across a very interesting passage from the Recognitions of Clement. The Recognitions of Clement, along with the Homilies, are the so-called Clementine literature, the Homilies and the Recognitions. And I won't go into too much historical detail, but they were texts written around 150 AD, most likely. And they were Jewish Christian texts, Ebionite texts, so-called. And they differ quite a bit from the canonical Gospels in many important ways, because they were written by Jewish Christians, the Ebionites, who come from the original disciples of Jesus, James, Peter, and others, who were vegetarians and who practiced simple living and adhered to most of the Jewish customs and traditions, not all, but a lot of it, and who were very interested in ritual baptism, ritual purification, fasting, spending time alone in the desert, all these things. All these original Christian practices were carried on by the disciples of Jesus, like James and Peter and others. That became the Ebionite movement. Ebionite just means the poor ones. So, austere, simple living was emphasized by this group, because it was emphasized by Jesus, you see. And so this is an interesting passage from the Recognitions of Clement, and it says, there are likewise amongst the Bactrians in the Indian countries immense multitudes of Brahmans, who also themselves, from the tradition of their ancestors and peaceful customs and laws, neither commit murder nor adultery, nor worship idols, nor have the practice of eating animal food, are never drunk, never do anything maliciously, but always fear God. And that is from the Recognitions of Clement, Book 9, Chapter 22. So isn't that fascinating? Written around 150 AD. And the author of this Christian text is discussing Indian Brahmins and their practice of vegetarianism and not drinking alcohol. The original Christians were teetotalers, I believe is the term commonly used, but it just means they abstained from alcohol. And of course, they were vegetarians. We know this even from the canonical writings of Paul. And so the letters of Paul that we find in the New Testament mention as much. And so, oftentimes I'll hear people say, oh, well, a lot of the evidence that the disciples were vegetarians and that Jesus was a vegetarian and whatnot, a lot of that evidence comes from non-canonical sources and historians, and you don't find it in the actual New Testament. Sure you do. Paul gets into an argument with some of Jesus' disciples about diet in his own letters. So we know for sure, at the very least, that James and Peter and some of the other disciples were certainly vegetarians, and most likely abstained from alcohol. And so there were a lot of redactions and things added to the Bible over the years, of course, to justify a lot of the Pauline tradition. So the Apostle Paul, who came later, who never knew Jesus, never met Jesus, he changed a lot of stuff, and his followers changed a lot of stuff because they were trying to appeal to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish public, And so they altered a lot of the original teachings, and the original Christianity was altered and corrupted by Paul. Paul was essentially like what you would think of as a modern cult leader. And so he corrupted the original teachings of Yeshua. At any rate, so we can see from this passage, from this Ebionite text, that in fact the early Christians were interested, at least, in the Indian traditions. They mention them. And so we can see that the early Christians thought it was cool that they had things in common with Indian Brahmins. They didn't judge them. They were praising them. Isn't that fascinating? And so, yeah, the early Christians were, in fact, vegetarians. The Essenes were vegetarians. We know this from the writings of Josephus and Philo and other historians that say they say as much. And so the Essenes, which are the pre-Christians, sort of the Proto-Christian movement, were in fact vegetarians. They lived out in the desert, in sort of isolated, remote locations away from population centers for the most part. And they were very austere. They abstained from alcohol. They did not eat meat. And they practiced a lot of prayer, as well as ritual baptism, and the so-called mikvahs, I believe they're called, these pools and streams and whatnot. John the Baptist practiced this ritual purification in the living waters of the Jordan River. And so John the Baptist was heavily influenced by the Essenes, probably was an Essene, but seems like he left that group and started his own thing. And Jesus was, of course, a follower of John the Baptist originally, and most likely grew up in an Essene community as well. And we know that John the Baptist was a vegetarian because it says, even in the Bible, that he ate honey, lived off honey and carobs. Carobs are these locust beans from the locust bean tree, the carob tree. And unfortunately, that was mistranslated later on because the word for carob, I'm sure many of you are familiar with carobs. They use it as a chocolate substitute. You can buy carob chips in most grocery stores these days. The word for carob and the word for locust in the Greek, I believe, are very, very similar, very close. And so, unfortunately, that got mistranslated later on as locusts. And so you hear, oh, John the Baptist lived off locusts and honey. No, he lived off carobs, carob beans, locust beans, and honey. And so they would make this bread. As a matter of fact, the bread that's made from carobs, from locust beans, that bread is known as St. John's bread. In the Mediterranean and in the Middle East, this type of bread is known as St. John's bread. So why in the world would that bread be named after John the Baptist if he didn't eat it? That's where that entire tradition comes from, of referring to this bread as St. John's bread, because John the Baptist, that's what he ate. So we know this now. So he didn't eat insects, he didn't eat bugs, he ate beans. And so he was a vegetarian. He had a very, very simple lifestyle and believed in very simple living. And the Essenes also believed in communal living. They shared all of their wealth with the community. They didn't really have private property, as it were. And so they were communitarians, not communists. A lot of people will say, oh, Jesus was a commie. Not really, because I don't know that he would have been in favor of um, a tyrannical government forcing people to share all of their private property with the state, with an authoritarian, totalitarian state. I don't think Jesus would have been all about that. He wasn't a big fan of Rome, if you'll remember. So yeah, I don't think he would have been in favor of an authoritarian, totalitarian, tyrannical government enforcing communitarianism. But voluntary communitarianism was a big part of the Essene movement. John the Baptist was also in favor of it. Jesus was also in favor of it. Jesus' disciples were also communitarians and believed in very simple living, and were not big fans of wealthy folks, as we can see from all the sacred scriptures. And at any rate, so John the Baptist was vegetarian, the Essenes were vegetarians, Jesus was most assuredly a vegetarian. His brother James was vegetarian. Now, why would James, his own brother and disciple, be a vegetarian and Jesus not be a vegetarian? If they were raised in the same household, why would Mary, Jesus' mother, why would she insist that James follow a vegetarian diet and not Jesus? It doesn't make any sense. And people will point to Jesus producing fish and loaves of bread for the multitudes and all that to assert that Jesus ate fish. Well, I don't, even if he did, I mean, okay, whatever, but that's also, that was a later redaction in addition to those verses in the New Testament, because, and we know this because the early church fathers wrote about this occasion, and they only mentioned the bread in every single instance. They never mentioned fish, and they were working with the earliest versions of the Gospels. The earliest versions of the canonical Gospels that they were reading and using never mentioned fish. They only mentioned bread. And so, and even some of the Aramaic translations and Syriac translations, I believe, of some of the canonical Gospels only mention bread. And so this was obviously added later by a scribe to, again, they were attempting to appeal this Pauline branch of Christianity was attempting to appeal to Gentiles, to non-Jews. And so they added a bunch of stuff, a lot, a whole lot, that was not there originally. And so none of the early church fathers that talk about this occasion where Jesus miraculously, produced food for the multitudes, they never mention fish. And they were working with the earliest versions of the Gospels, which means that the fish addition was most likely added after about 150 AD, 200 AD, somewhere around there. But the original versions of the Gospels do not mention fish. Likewise, Jesus did not drink, contrary to popular belief. As a matter of fact, I know many Christians, especially here in South America, that drink wine daily. I mean, drink wine with almost every meal. And their justification for doing so is that Jesus drank wine. It's a very Christianly thing to do, to drink wine. Well, this is simply not the case. The word used for wine in the ancient Hebrew is the same word used for grape juice. They use the same word for both. And grape juice was also very popular during that period, historically. And so it was just slightly fermented, had maybe 1% alcohol, 2% maybe, something like that. And you would have to drink a tremendous amount of it to get intoxicated. Jesus would not, he would not have produced an alcoholic beverage for a bunch of people to get drunk off of. That he wasn't that kind of guy. He would not have done that. And so what he did, if he did it at all, I mean, who knows about any of these miracles in these stories, but if that was true and he did produce that, it was simply grape juice that may have had 1% alcohol or something like that. He wasn't out to get people drunk. So the earliest Proto-Christians, the Essenes and the John the Baptist group and all of that, were vegetarians. They were very into simple living. They were communitarians. They did not drink alcohol, and they had a very simple lifestyle, a very holy lifestyle. The Gospel of Thomas contains the original mystical teachings of Yeshua. Now, if you Google it and you look on, Wikipedia or read apologist literature regarding the Gospel of Thomas, well, they'll tell you that it was written around 150 AD. The problem with that is that it contains a lot of the same verses and teachings that come from the so-called Q source or Q material. The Q source was the original source for the canonical Gospels, especially Matthew and Luke. Now, we don't have any physical proof of the Q source, but it's essentially agreed upon by 90% of scholars and academics that it must have existed, because Matthew and Luke share so many verses and teachings in common. And we know that they got it from a common source, which has come to be known as Q. I highly recommend to read John Kloppenborg's book, The Formation of Q. It's a heavy read. It's a dense read, and you do have to have some previous training and religious scholarship and whatnot to understand a lot of it, if not most of it. But you can also watch some of his videos and interviews and whatnot on YouTube if you don't want to dive into the book. It's called The Formation of Q, and he's done excellent research regarding Q. And he has come to the conclusion, and I agree with him, that Q was probably written in 3 separate periods. That's certainly what it looks like from all the evidence. And the original Q teachings were the original teachings of Jesus, and that some of that later Q stuff had more to do with the Pauline influence, coming judgment, the end of the world, and all that kind of stuff. But that was added later, and Jesus probably didn't really focus much on that. John the Baptist did, and some of the Essene groups did. If you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were some of them probably written by some groups associated with the Essenes. The Essenes was not a monolithic movement. It was very diverse. But it does look like the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a group from Qumran who were somewhat associated with the Essenes, although when you look at the historical writings of Josephus, Philo, Pliny the Elder, and all that, they don't have everything in common with that Qumran group. So that Qumran group seems to have been slightly different in certain important ways. At any rate, some of the Essenes were certainly apocalyptic, and they did think that the end of the world was coming. John the Baptist seemed to think so, but Jesus didn't really talk about that a whole lot. And a lot of the verses that you find in the canonical Gospels were probably added later. They were redactions. And so the earliest teachings of Jesus, the earliest Q material, are just wisdom sayings, wisdom teachings. Like a lot of what you find on the Sermon on the Mount, for example, which is just a beautiful, beautiful group of teachings. That's the original Q stuff. Those were the original teachings of Jesus. Well, if you look at those teachings and then you look at the Gospel of Thomas, well, they have an awful lot in common, because the Gospel of Thomas is just essentially a list of Jesus's wisdom sayings or wisdom teachings. And so actually what we find in the Gospel of Thomas is Q. I believe that. I think that the Gospel of Thomas, not all of it, not every single verse, because even the Gospel of Thomas had some later redactions and additions and all that. But a lot of what we find in the Gospel of Thomas derives from the original Q source, the original teachings of Jesus, the earliest teachings of Jesus, and they are mystical. They are enlightenment teachings. Jesus was, for all intents and purposes, an enlightened yogi. Okay? Much more enlightened than John the Baptist, than the Essenes, all the Proto-Christian groups, and even the later Ebionites, Jesus' disciples. Jesus was different. He was on another level, because he was a master. It's just like what we find in all the traditions, all the religions. It always starts off with a mystical teacher, an enlightened master, and then over the years, the disciples corrupt the teachings, they dilute the teachings, they misinterpret the teachings. And typically what happens is these groups come to worship the teacher instead of trying to become like the teacher. And so they create these personality cults based upon the worship of the teacher rather than trying to be like their teacher. This happens all the time. It's a historical trend throughout all of religious history. But Jesus was different. He was certainly an enlightened teacher, and we find the evidence of this in his earliest, in his real teachings, which we can find in the original Q source and also in the Gospel of Thomas, because they're one and the same. There's an excellent book. Again, it's a pretty heavy, dense read, called Ancient Christian Gospels by Helmut Kester. It's one of my favorite books that I've ever read. And it's probably, his research is some of the most important research ever done in the history of Christianity. He says, the close relationships of the Gospel of Thomas to Q cannot be accidental. Since the typical Son of Man sayings and announcements of judgments, which are characteristic of the redaction of Q, are never paralleled in the Gospel of Thomas, it is evident that its author had no knowledge of the final version of Q, nor of the secondary apocalyptic interpretation that the redactor of Q superimposed upon earlier eschatological sayings. The Gospel of Thomas is either dependent upon Q's earlier version or upon clusters of sayings employed in its composition. Okay? So this proves that the Gospel of Thomas is based on the oldest Q writings, the earliest writings. Christian writings, written down probably by Jesus' disciples or scribes associated with Jesus' disciples. So the Gospel of Thomas really contains the earliest, truest, purest Christian teachings. And so that's why I'm such a fan of the Gospel of Thomas, because it preserves those earliest teachings, enlightenment teachings, mystical teachings of Yeshua. And you can see in it the Essene influence. And then when you look at the later Ebionite writings, the so-called Clementine literature, recognitions and homilies, you also see that Essene influence. The vegetarianism, the pacifism, the communitarianism, the simple living, the deep prayer practices. And so there's this lineage, this through line that we can detect, starting with the Proto-Christian movement. And by the way, the Essenes, they according to them, really trace their lineage all the way back to the original Jewish teachings. And so we can think of them as sort of like this mystery school, this sort of like secret society almost, that preserved those original esoteric metaphysical teachings from way back. Who knows how far back? Okay? And they had a lot in common with the Pythagoreans also from Greece, which also traced their lineage way back to ancient Egyptian sources. Ancient mystery schools and secret societies from Egypt, really. And so that all gets carried down from ancient times. Possibly from, all the way back to Satya Yuga, which ended, I think around 5,000 BC or something like that, 6,000 BC. But those teachings were preserved through small groups and all the way up till today. Now, they're preserved in a more detailed way, of course, in the Indian literature, like the Upanishads and all of that. But, again, looking at this verse from this Christian writing from the Ebionites, we can see that they were into it. They were into the Brahmins. I'll read this one more time. And again, this comes from around 150 AD, possibly earlier. We don't really know. From this Ebionite text, the Recognitions of Clement, Book 9, Chapter 22, says, "There are likewise amongst the Bactrians and the Indian countries immense multitudes of Brahmans, who also themselves, from the tradition of their ancestors and peaceful customs and laws, neither commit murder nor adultery, nor worship idols, nor have the practice of eating animal food, are never drunk, never do anything maliciously, but always fear God." In other words, they're like us. They're just like us. They're praising them. They're not criticizing them. They're not judging them. They're saying, oh yeah, they're like us. They practice the same tradition that we do. They're vegetarians. They're pacifists. They don't drink alcohol. They don't do anything maliciously. They're kind, they're generous, they're selfless, they're loving, they're compassionate. They're like us. They are like we Christians. So they're praising them. Isn't that fascinating? This interesting connection. And so, in other words, the early Christians were aware of these Indian traditions. And of course, you have the stories of Jesus having possibly traveled to ancient India, we don't know anything about Jesus from the age of 12 to 30 or whatever. And so people have theorized that he possibly traveled all the way to India and all of this. And there's a little bit of evidence. There's a little bit of evidence. But not enough to fully convince me, to be honest. I've looked into it in great detail. I've read a lot of the books. It's far-fetched, let's just say that, for a 12, 13-year-old boy who didn't know any of the languages to travel along the Silk Road by himself all the way to India 2,000 years ago. It's a bit of a stretch. But the thing is, he didn't need to go to India because all those teachings were already available to him through this Essene movement. And he was enlightened. I mean, he learned on his own, as many enlightened masters do. And so he didn't really need to go to India to learn what he learned, to teach what he taught. But it's possible. It's possible. And of course, his disciple Thomas, where we get the Gospel of Thomas, I don't know that Thomas actually wrote it, but it certainly comes out of the Thomasine tradition, as it were. Thomas, there's more evidence to suggest that Thomas did, in fact, travel to India after Jesus' death, and that he actually died in India, and he founded the first Christian churches in India and all of that. There's more evidence to suggest that that was the case. But one might ask the question, well, why did Thomas decide to go to India? Well, probably Jesus told him to go there before he died. Why would Jesus tell Thomas to go to India unless he knew something about India or he had possibly been to India? And so there were more connections in the ancient world than we realize. There were probably groups of Buddhists, it looks like. There's some historical evidence to suggest that there were, in fact, groups of Buddhists living in Egypt during the time of Jesus, during his lifetime. Jesus almost assuredly spent time in Egypt. That we know, that there's far more likelihood that he did spend time in Egypt than India. And if there were Buddhists living in Egypt at that time, perhaps he was influenced by those Buddhist groups in Egypt. And so he didn't really need to go all the way to India. He could have learned about India and Indian teachings through these Buddhist groups that lived in Egypt, you see. But he seemed to be interested in India at the very least. Thomas certainly was. And the early Christians, especially the Ebionite groups, we can see, were also interested in India and the Indian traditions, Indian teachings. Isn't that fascinating? It's interesting to see that these Enlightenment traditions are not only from India, and that we actually have Western Enlightenment traditions, and that Christianity itself is an Enlightenment tradition, very similar to what we find in ancient India. I also highly recommend to read The Lost Religion of Jesus by Keith Akers. I'll be talking more about that book in future episodes. Y'all know I did an interview with him not too long ago. And he is featured in the new documentary Christspiracy. And it's not really out yet for public consumption, streaming anywhere. It's been shown in theaters. But it will be available on streaming platforms shortly, I'm told. So Keith Akers' book, The Lost Religion of Jesus, is the best book I've ever read regarding early Christianity. It's probably, right now, it's right up there with my favorite books that I've ever read. It's that important to me. I'm that passionate about his research and his work. It's just of the highest caliber and order. So again, I recommend to read The Formation of Q by John Kloppenborg, Ancient Christian Gospels by Helmut Kester. Also the works of Elaine Pagels. Her research in the Gospel of Thomas is excellent. Her books are really good. And The Lost Religion of Jesus by Keith Akers. Also his book Disciples. Disciples by Keith Akers is also really, really good. So anyway, we'll continue our exploration of early Christianity and what Keith Akers calls the lost religion of Jesus, which was based on communitarianism, pacifism, simple living, austere living, vegetarianism, not abstaining from alcohol and intoxicants, a deep prayer practice, ritual, bathing, baptism, cold water therapy, which has become very popular nowadays, right? So all of that was the original Christianity, which sounds a lot like the yoga tradition and what is taught in the ancient yoga texts. The only thing that's missing really is this very specific meditation practice that produces superconscious states, or really unveils our nature as a spiritual being. I'm sure they did have practices, again, contemplative prayer and all of that, but you don't find written material regarding those practices in the early Christian movement, like you do in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, for example, and some of the Upanishads and whatnot. Anyway, I'll continue my work as we continue to unite East and West,